Hey everyone, my name is Justin, and I am a dungeon master for the game Dungeons and Dragons. I'm also the creator of PerfectMachinations.com, which is a website dedicated to helping game masters and dungeon masters run a better game. It is my hope that this channel will be another medium to help dungeon masters and game masters elevate their own games to create a rewarding experience for their players, and also a rewarding experience for themselves as well. Because in Dungeons and Dragons, the goal is that everyone, including the dungeon master, is having a great time. So before I tell you what kind of content you can expect on this channel, I'm going to tell you what you're not going to find on here. So in terms of teaching people the mechanics of the game, or helping brand new dungeon masters run their first session, I'm not very good at that. I am still relatively new myself. I've only been running the game for about 2 years. So this channel is going to assume that you've DM'd for at least a couple sessions. This channel's goal is to help dungeon masters find some new inspiration or give them ideas that they can use in their own game. And that's what we're going to do today. So for our very first topic here on the channel, we're actually going to discuss reading. Reading is the most important tool, in my opinion, in the Dungeon Master's arsenal. The greatest thing about Dungeons and Dragons is you can pull anything from anywhere and make an adventure. And books offer probably the best medium to do that. Because after all, D&D is a collaborative story. It's you and your players creating a world and then finding stories within it. And that's why I believe that reading is probably the most powerful tool that you have at your disposal. And I know some of you are out there thinking, so you're telling me that the best thing I can do if I want to look for inspiration is read. Yes, that's what I'm telling you. You need to read books. You need to read stories. You need to read anything that you can. It doesn't matter what it is, but you should be reading. Not for the simple fact that you can find some great ideas for your games, but reading itself is just great. It's one of my favorite things to do, and it's one of my favorite hobbies. But it didn't used to be that way. I used to not like reading so much, and I know some of you out there might be feeling the same way. So some of you are probably asking, well, I don't really like reading books that much. I don't know how to find a book that interests me. And I can relate to that. So I really didn't get into reading until I was in college, actually. I didn't really find it very enjoyable in high school, and I definitely didn't find it enjoyable before that. This was the book that got me interested in reading. Actually, it's one story in this book that got me interested in reading. The Call of Cthulhu. I'm sure most of you have heard about Cthulhu. Some of you may even read H.P. Lovecraft. But that was a story that really got me hooked into reading. And I know that's probably not the best story to get interested in reading, but I enjoy that kind of stuff, and most of my campaigns focus on the weird, the strange, and sometimes even the horrific. And H.P. Lovecraft just really speaks to me. The cosmic horror, the sense of dread, and the unspeakable terror that lies just beyond the veil of our imaginations. You can tell that I really enjoy those types of stories. And I also enjoy short stories, which, coincidentally enough, that's all H.P. Lovecraft pretty much wrote. So I read a lot of short stories. And we're actually going to be talking about a book of short stories. And more importantly, we're going to be talking about one of those stories in that book. And we're going to be not really creating an adventure out of it, but hopefully I can give you some ideas for your next game. One of the cool things that you'll find reading authors from a long time ago is that they all borrowed inspiration from each other. Very much like what Dungeon Masters do right now. So, reading H.P. Lovecraft, I actually came across a couple other authors that either inspired him or that he directly corresponded with. If you don't know much about H.P. Lovecraft, he wrote a lot of letters, and I mean a lot. He had a lot of correspondence, probably all over the world, at least in the United States. And he read a lot of stuff, a lot of stories that were very similar to his own. And he even pulled a lot of that information from other writers that focus on the same genres as he did. So one of those authors is actually who we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be talking about Clark Ashton Smith. And this is the Dark Adelon and other fantasies. And I don't know if I pronounce Eidolon or Adelon correctly, but yeah, that's a word. But where was I? Oh, yes. So H.P. Lovecraft borrowed a lot of ideas from Clark Ashton Smith. He actually really enjoyed Smith's writing. And to give an example of some of the ideas that H.P. Lovecraft borrowed from Smith, so if you're a reader of H.P. Lovecraft, he talks about a few different books. He likes to bring these books up quite a lot. So the most famous one is the Necronomicon, which has been used in a whole bunch of different stories and movies, and pretty much it's probably been brought up in every type of medium. But another book that's not as well known is the Book of Abon. The Book of Abon is actually a creation of Clark Ashton Smith. It comes up in a couple of his stories, and H.P. Lovecraft really enjoyed the title and uses it in his stories. And Smith does not say what the Book of Abon is. So H.P. Lovecraft didn't either. So it kind of created that nice mystery between both of them. So you'll find that some authors from that time period, namely around the 1900s, especially with weird fiction, since it wasn't super popular at the time, a lot of the authors were okay with actually sharing ideas, and H.P. Lovecraft did it all the time, and he actually would be glad when other authors that he was corresponding with were using some of his ideas. They enjoyed working with each other to create their stories. So, the Book of Abon is featured in my campaigns. I put it in every single campaign that I run. It doesn't matter what the setting is or what the tone of the campaign is. The players always find the Book of Abon, no matter what. And it's usually within the first or second adventure that they go on, they find it. So, unlike the authors, Lovecraft and Smith, my players are going to want to read it and want to know what's in it. So, here is what I think the Book of Abon is in my campaign. So, when the players find it, they almost always find it in some place where they're not supposed to be. Usually, it's in a place of evil or some ancient ruins, but they always find it. It's always on the bookshelf next to a bunch of other books that either can't be read or sound a little too scary to read. So the Book of Abon, when my players pick it up, it always says the same thing. It's about the wizard named Abon. And Abon was a wizard who was very interested in traveling the planes of the multiverse. And he was most interested in the astral plane. And during his experiments and his research, he was actually able to find a way to the astral plane. And while he was in the astral plane, he conducted some experiments. And they weren't the nicest of experiments. And the book pretty much details the type of experiments that he conducted. and most of them involved living things, namely humans. So my players almost always find this book, and usually I'll have maybe a spell in there that they don't normally have access to that they can learn. I mean, you can pretty much put anything in there, or it can just be a story. Typically, any book that I put in my settings, I at least have a summary written down of what the book's about. Or maybe the players slip through a couple chapters, and I tell them what the chapter's about. I think it's important that if we're going to be putting items in our campaigns or our games, if it has a name, especially a book, then the players should be able to read it. Maybe not right then and there. Maybe you have a really cool idea for a book name and you put it in your story. But you don't really figure that the players are going to want to read it, because usually the players just grab it and throw it in a bag and it's never brought up again. But if your players actually say, hey, what's in this book? And if you don't know, instead of saying, it doesn't have any pages, it's blank, you can say, well, it's written in Infernal. And you should know by now that whichever players you have, they shouldn't be able to speak Infernal. Because if they speak Infernal, then they're still going to want to know what it says. So pick a language that the players don't have for their characters. That way, maybe the book can serve as a plot point later on. Maybe the players are saying, hey, we want to know what's in this book. Let's go find somebody to translate this book for us. And there you go. You have an adventure just like that. That's one of the great things about this game, and you're going to be hearing that phrase a lot from me, because honestly, this game is the greatest game, in my opinion, created by mankind. Only in this game can the players take something as mundane as a book and make a whole adventure about it. And I've seemed to have gotten off topic of what we were talking about. And unfortunately, that's going to happen a little bit, but hopefully through my constant diversions and, all those other things, hopefully you'll find some information that is useful, or maybe an idea that you can use. But we're not here to talk about my ideas for adventures. We're here to actually talk about books and stories that you can use for your own, and more importantly, actually read. So we today are going to be covering The Maze of the Enchanter, which is in the book The Dark Adelon and Other Fantasies by Clark Ashton Smith. With no other light than that of the 4 diminutive moons of Zikarf, each in a different phase but all decrescent, Taglari had crossed the bottomless swamp of Zorm, where no reptile dwelt and no dragon descended, but where the pitch-black ooze was alive with continual heavings and writhings. So that's the first paragraph to The Maze of the Enchanter. And you'll quickly realize that Clark Ashton Smith not only dabbled in fantasy, but he liked to write a little bit of science fiction as well. So when he talks about the 4 moons in this story, you can tell that you're not in Middle Earth. You're on another planet altogether. And I've read a lot of Smith's short stories, but this so far is my favorite. And keep in mind, I've only discovered him a few months ago, so I haven't read everything that he's ever written. But The Maze of the Enchanter is by far one of my favorite. So we're actually going to cover the story quite a bit. So if you're interested in actually reading the story, I would advise to either skip this part of the video or go find a way to read it. I got my copy on Amazon. I think most of this work is probably within the public sphere now, so you can probably just get it online and read it. But if you're like me, I really like having a physical copy to read. But if you want to know more about the story before I go ahead and pretty much ruin it for you, go ahead and stop the video now. Maybe come back later after you've read it. But we're actually going to talk about the plot and the characters that are involved in the Maze of the Enchanter. So pretty much the entire story revolves around one character, and that would be our protagonist, Ticlari. I have no idea if I'm pronouncing that correctly. It's Tiglari. So Smith used a lot of very interesting words. Some I have chosen to use in my campaigns. Others I can't pronounce, so I don't put them in my campaigns. But Smith was a very creative wordsmith. So, like I said, it revolves around pretty much one character, and that is Ticlari. That's who we're getting the vision of the story through. So Ticlari is a warrior on the planet Zikarf. And he is trying to track down the evil tyrant known as Maldweb. And yes, I use Maldweb in some of my campaigns, because it is a very cool name. But anyway, so Ticlari is actually trying to find Maldweb and kill him. For you see, Maldweb is a tyrant. And lately, he has become obsessed with capturing every beautiful woman that lives in this region of the planet. And unfortunately for Ticlari, well, Maldweb has absconded with his love interest. What's more interesting, though, because this is pretty much a basic trope in fantasies, the damsel in distress. Well, in this case, the love interest actually has no interest in Ticlari. But Ticlari is wanting to win her affections, so he figures if he saves her from the evil tyrant Maldweb, that he has a chance with her. And so, he does what any hero does. He suits up for battle, and he goes and seeks the villain to save the one that he loves. So our story begins with Ticlari preparing to go and find Maldweb and kill him. So Ticlari already knows some information about the location that Maldweb currently resides in. He knows that Maldweb lives in a mountain palace, far away from any jungle that Ticlari's ever adventured in. So right away, Ticlari's going to go outside of his comfort zone to fight for the one that he loves and hopefully win her affection. So that's a pretty common trope in adventures, is it's getting the players or the characters out of their comfort zone. So if your character was brought up on a farm for all their life and they go to the city, that's going to be a culture shock for them. That's going to be a big change in their life. And that's typically how adventures start. You're going somewhere else. No one really probably has heard many stories about an epic adventure that takes place in the same town that the PCs grew up in. I'm sure it's possible, but you don't hear it too much. So Ticlari is actually preparing to cross the dreaded fens, which is pretty much a type of swamp. He's going to cross the swamp to get to the mountain palace of Maldweb. He's going to scale the mountain, and he's going to kill Maldweb. That is his plan. And like any good hero, he has his favorite weapon. So like Arthur had Excalibur, Ticlari has a giant pointy knife that he has coated in the blood of the Chimera, a very poisonous beast. And his plan is to sneak into the palace and hopefully kill Maldweb before he knows what's going on. So Ticlari is painted as a jungle warrior, but in this instance, he's almost painted as an assassin. So you could probably argue that he's a rogue. He relies on stealth to hunt beasts, and he relies on special weapons to take those beasts down. And so to Ticlari, Maldweb is just another beast that is meant for him to slay. And he prepares for it just like he would prepare for any other hunt. And there's also another interesting twist to this story. There's actually another jungle warrior that went after Ticlari's love interest because, shocker, he's in love with her too. So he actually set off before Ticlari to go and try to find Maldweb. So not only is Taglari going to have to try to kill Maldweb, but he's going to have to do it before this other guy does it. And unfortunately, that name kind of escapes me from now, but if I figure it out before then, before this video is over, I will remind you and let you know what his name is. So anyway, from this point in the story, Taglari is preparing to go and kill Maldweb and hopefully win the heart of his love interest. Taglari is not your simple jungle warrior that he is depicted in the opening paragraphs of the story. He's actually rather cunning. So if you want to think about him as more likely towards, Conan the Barbarian, you probably can. Taglari seems to know a lot of information beforehand. I mean, he obviously knows where the palace is at, but more importantly, he knows what side of the palace to climb. He seems to know the defenses that are in this palace, which it's mentioned that no one has ever made it into the palace and ever returned. So I'm not quite sure how he got this information. The story's not really too clear on that, but Taglari seems to know where he needs to go, the best route to get there, and he also has another bit of interesting information that he knows. So Taglari knows that there are some type of beasts that guard the outer walls of Maldweb's palace. And these beasts apparently are repelled by a certain smell. So Taglari covers himself, and I believe it's some type of plant material. It might even be some type of excrement. But he covers himself in this material because he knows that it will repel these creatures so that he won't have to fight them. So before we even get into the adventure, Taglari's pretty much already got it all mapped out. He knows where he needs to go, and he knows what he needs to do to get through these defenses and ultimately find and kill Maldweb. And the person that has left before him is known as Mokare, and he's also described as a rather impressive jungle warrior. So Taglari decides to head out rather quickly to try to catch up to Mokare so that he can be the one that kills Maldweb, even though no other man has ever been able to do so. So it skips to the scene where Taglari actually makes it to the mountain palace, and it actually talks about him ascending the mountain to get to the palace. So there's a couple sections in the story where it covers the sections of the palace itself. So before Taglari even gets into the palace, he has to go through the gardens, and these gardens are kind of all over the top of this mountain. And it describes that there's gaps that Taglari has to jump across. It describes these very vibrant gardens that have all these plants that Taglari has never seen before in his life, kind of alluding to the fact that Maldweb has traveled the world and has brought back these specimens and planted them here to create these magnificent and at times terror-inducing gardens. So this is a really cool location for not only the story, but if you want to use it in an adventure, I think it would really work. There's a lot of detail that's posted about these gardens and about what type of plants and other items that are actually in the gardens. So having your players maybe stumble into, if they're trying to get into some ancient ruins, maybe have them go across some ancient gardens first. And this kind of gives a little bit more depth to the ruins itself, other than just being a bunch of old rocks that descend into the earth. Wouldn't it be cool if they stumbled upon ancient gardens that used to be tended by a race that has long since been gone, and these gardens are the only reminder that this race ever existed? I personally think that's a really cool idea, and I'll definitely be using it in some of my games. So Taglari goes across these gardens, and we actually finally get a glimpse at the beast that Taglari was pretty much protecting himself from when he rubbed this material all over his body. So these beasts resemble pretty much like apes, if you want to think of them that way. They look like they're giant primates. They have really dark fur, and they're just very large monstrosities. And Taklari actually runs across a group of them, and due to the smell coming off of his body, these creatures actually retreat, and he does not fight them. So Taklari, while he is painted as a warrior, he has some intelligence. He knows that he doesn't want to expend his energy or his weapon against these creatures of Maldweb, because he knows that the tyrant himself is a much more dangerous enemy, and if he's able to simply elude Maldweb's protective forces, then he can easily sneak into the palace, find Maldweb, and ultimately kill him. And from then on, from the gardens, he's actually able to make it into the palace itself. So after scaling to the top of the palace with his knife coated in winged viper poison, and yes, it's winged viper poison, the sheath is actually made of chimera skin. So the poison is winged viper poison. So I just figure I'd clear that up for everybody that was wondering and who actually reads this story and says he doesn't know what the hell he's talking about. So yes, it is winged viper venom, not chimera venom. Okay. All right. So we're going to move on from there. So Taklari makes it to the palace itself, and he actually finds a coil of rope right next to his rope. So he knows that Mokare has made it this far. So he kind of picks up the pace a little bit and actually heads into the palace. So the palace itself is very vast, and there's many different hallways and many different rooms that reside in this palace. And Taklari knows that Maldweb has servants that inhabit the interior of the palace. And these aren't normal servants. These are constructs. They're kind of regarded as clockwork creatures. So pretty much, I guess, robots, if you really want to think about it that way. So here again is Smith's injection of science fiction. So he has pretty much created a race of mechanical creatures that act as the servants and butlers and protectors of the interior parts of Maldweb's palace. So Taklari knows that his weapon will have little to no effect on these constructs, so he is going to try to stay in the shadows and bypass them, because he knows that if he is spotted, there's little to no chance that he's going to be able to defeat them with just a knife. So Taklari sneaks through the palace using the shadows to his advantage, and eventually he comes to a room that has numerous amounts of women in it. Or so he thinks they're women. They actually appear to be more like statues. And it's left up to the reader to decide whether or not that these are the actual women that were taken away from this region, or if these are statues of women. But it's pretty clear to me that Maldweb has used some type of magic to kind of freeze them in place. So there's roughly about 50 women in this large chamber, and they're all kind of stuck in some type of suspended animation. And it's my opinion, and probably everybody else's opinion that's read this story, that there's some type of magic that is actually keeping them locked in place so that they can't move. They're pretty much separated from time and space due to Maldweb's magic. So Taklari kind of searches this room briefly to find his love interest, and his love interest is actually known as Athle, and that is spelled Athle. So I believe that's pronounced Athle. So he doesn't see Athle in this room, and he figures that since she is the most beautiful woman in this region that Maldweb would not keep her in here with the rest of these women. So his search continues. So as he continues to head through the palace, he comes to a room where it just so happens that Maldweb is asleep on a throne. And Taklari goes into hunter mode. So creeping across the shadows of this palatial floor, so it's made up of very expensive marble, very shiny, and it's mentioned that Taklari can see himself in it as he's moving across it. And he goes ahead and unsheathes his knife and gets as close as he can to Maldweb until he can hear the tyrant snoring or breathing. I can't remember which. But he positions himself over Maldweb as he slowly takes the weapon out of his sheath and with two hands holds it above the tyrant. And just as he plunges the knife down into the chest of Maldweb, the enchanter disappears. It was an illusion, a trap. And the room fills up with Maldweb's voice, who pretty much taunts Taklari. But then another door just happens to open in the palace, the same room that Taklari's in. And Maldweb explains to Taklari that he will have to go through his maze in order to find what he is looking for. And to make sure that Taklari goes through the maze, two automatons show up, both of them wielding twin blades where their hands should be. Kind of as a way to say, yeah, you should probably go into the maze. So Taklari has no choice, and he must move forward. So it is this point in the story where Taklari heads into the fabled maze of Maldweb. "What do you seek, Taklari?" said the voice. "Do you think to enter with impunity the palace of Maldweb? Others, many others, with the same intentions, have come before you, but all have paid a certain price for their temerity." That's the first time that Taklari hears the voice of Maldweb, who's basically taunting him into thinking that he could so foolishly get into the palace and ultimately kill him. So, Maldweb is someone that we've heard of before, obviously, in the beginning of the story, but not much is really said about him. So it is in this section of the story that we're going to learn the most about him. And he's probably my most favorite villain that appears in a short story. And you'll find out a little bit more about that later. But Maldweb is obviously a wizard, and in this story he's known as an enchanter. But he's obviously a wizard that has immense power. We've seen that he can apparently freeze people, so to keep them in their current form. Because as you're going to find out later, Maldweb has a very complex personality. And there's a certain reason why he is kidnapping these women and pretty much holding them hostage in his palace and keeping them in suspended animation. So there's another section on this very same page where we get another glimpse into the mind of Maldweb and his personality. Taklari is actually speaking about Athlay and saying that he is searching for her, to which Maldweb replies, "Athlay is very beautiful," replied the voice. "It is the will of Maldweb to make a certain use of her loveliness. The use is not one that should concern a hunter of wild beasts. You are unwise, Taklari." So, like a typical villain, he is monologuing. And in any adventure, as any DM knows, it's kind of our moment to shine when the heroes actually encounter the villain, possibly for the first time and possibly for the last time. So we really enjoy being able to do a brief monologue for our villain. After all, it is a character that we have worked hours upon perfecting. Some of us even trying to perfect a certain voice or a certain personality that we try to give to our creation. So I'm asking this of any of the players that are actually watching this video. If your DM has taken the time to come up with an elaborate speech for his villain, please don't interrupt it. I know that it's very taboo to interfere with the players or the characters. Can't really think of the word right now, but to control their actions. I know it's not right to do that, but D&D is a collaborative storytelling game. And while the players make up most of that story, the DM has a say in it too. So if your DM has worked really hard to create a situation or a villain, give him or her just a few minutes to kind of bring that villain onto the stage. Don't interrupt them and say I cast fireball or something like that. To me it's a little rude. But I mean, I can understand where players come from because they want to catch the villain off guard, and the best time to catch a villain off guard is when he is monologuing to you. But keep in mind, it's a collaborative game. It's not you versus the DM. And I'm sure, like most DMs, the DM usually caters to the players pretty well, because we want the players to succeed. Because if they don't, then no one has fun. So just my little public service announcement with villains that are monologuing. So we'll get back to our regularly scheduled program. So Maldweb has pretty much just taunted Tiglari and told him that he's wasting his time trying to search for Athlay, and that he should no longer concern himself with her because it frankly does not concern him, because he is not all-powerful like Maldweb is. But Maldweb, being an interesting villain, offers Tiglari a chance to search for what he's looking for. And that is in the maze. So Tiglari is forced to head into the maze of Maldweb to try to find his love interest. And as he heads into the maze, it's very clear that the maze has a personality all to itself. And this personality seems to change the further that Tiglari goes. And if this doesn't sound like D&D, I don't know what does. If you've ever played D&D in a dungeon, so the dungeon part of Dungeons and Dragons, you'll know what I'm talking about. Typically, as you go further into a dungeon or you go lower in a dungeon, the difficulty gets harder. It ramps up. You start seeing things and creatures that you haven't seen before, and they're usually a little bit more powerful, and you start encountering traps that are more deadly. So the maze, as he goes further in, becomes more and more deadly and actually starts showing the moods of its creator, which is interesting. So it describes the maze, or the parts of the maze that Tiglari goes through, as representing the current mood of its creator. So we know that the creator is most likely Maldweb, who has designed such a terrible place. And the story leads us to believe that as Maldweb was designing this maze, depending on his mood, the maze changed, meaning the colors of the flowers changed, or the types of plants that Maldweb used changed. I mean, there's a section of the maze where it's just pretty much all thorns and just these vine-choking plants. So it kind of gives us another look into the mind of Maldweb, that he's not simply just an evil maniac bent on power, but he has emotions and he has thoughts. And the maze manifests those thoughts and feelings. And as Taklari goes through the maze, he encounters more of the ape-like creatures, and coincidentally enough, he finds one that looks an awful lot like Mokair. And it's very quickly realized that Mokair did not make it this far. That he indeed was turned into one of these horrible abominations. And because Taklari is still covered in the foul-smelling material, Mokair flees. And Taklari continues on into the maze. Well, I wish I could tell you that the story has a happy ending and that Taklari finds Maldweb and ultimately kills him and saves Athlay, and Athlay realizes that Taklari is the love of her life and they live happily ever after together. But that doesn't happen. So Taklari makes it to a section of the maze where there are vines that end up, unfortunately, wrapping him up, and he is sprayed with some kind of pollen. And that's pretty much when the transformation starts to happen. Maldweb appears and pretty much tells Taklari that he will spend the rest of his days in this maze that he has created. But due to the fact that Taklari is a good hunter and made it this far, Maldweb has allowed him to keep his same face when he morphs into this hideous abomination, and allows him to live in the maze instead of just killing him, which is rather kind, I guess, considering the other options. So Taklari failed. He wasn't able to save Athlay. So what does that mean for our characters? Are they gonna fail? They're not gonna be able to save the person that they've come to rescue? Or they're not gonna be able to kill Maldweb? Well, that's up to you. Just because your players fail at a quest doesn't mean they lose the game. Failure breeds character. It creates more drama. So if you do have the players in this type of situation where they're facing a villain that is way beyond their ken, it's likely they're going to fail. And you should know that going into it based on how powerful you know that this villain is. And it's okay to do those type of situations, but you also have to realize that people respond differently to failure. And your players may not like that. So it's best to know your players before you go ahead and actually implement a situation where the chances of them succeeding are slim to none. Some players really enjoy it, though, because it creates a villain that lasts the rest of the campaign. So if you're going to use Maldweb, and you're going to have him be as powerful as he is in the story, make sure that there's a way that the players see him again. Do everything in your power to make sure that he just doesn't kill the players. Because as we learned about Maldweb, he's not just about killing anything. He's all about making sure that people know who he is and how powerful he is. And he set an example when he turned Taklari into the very beast that he typically hunts. Maldweb has a personality. And some of your villains should have this type of personality. Not all your villains need to be cookie cutter, want to destroy the world or want to take over the world type of people or creatures. It's okay to have villains that actually have thoughts and feelings other than just complete domination of everything around them. And they can still have those thoughts and still want that, but give them some type of human emotion to feel. make it so that the players really connect to this villain. They shouldn't like Maldweb, but they should at least know where he's coming from. Or they should at least understand his motives for why he is doing this. I've had a campaign where I had a villain that the players hated. They hated him with a passion. And the reason they hated him is because what he would say to them when he would run into them made complete sense to them. But they knew it was wrong. And they hated him for that. They wanted nothing more to destroy him, but they understood what he was talking about. It made sense to them. They felt some of the same things that he felt. They went about it a very different way than he does. But they hated him because they realized that they weren't that far away from being him. And that made him probably my most memorable villain. And he'll definitely be a topic of conversation in another one of my videos, because I think I could talk or use an entire video to discuss that villain and that particular campaign. So we get a glimpse into Maldweb in the final few pages. And it's something that I didn't expect to read, and it's one of the reasons why this is one of my favorite short stories by Clark Ashton Smith. So, at this point in the story, the protagonist, Tiklari, has failed. He made it through some of the maze and unfortunately was turned into an apish beast by Maldweb. So he is now the very beast that he once hunted. And Maldweb has banished him into the maze. And Tiklari has gone so obediently. So this is when we kind of get another glimpse at Maldweb's personality, because he's pretty much alone in the maze right now. He's kind of in the middle of a courtyard, and one of his constructs actually shows up, and Maldweb has a conversation with the construct, if you really want to call it a conversation. So Maldweb admits that he has this peculiar thing for eternalizing the beauty of women. And that's why he is keeping them in suspended animation. And he kind of questions this. But the construct being created by him, when asked the question, answers that Maldweb is all-knowing and all-powerful, and that his will shall be done. And Maldweb agrees with this. And that makes sense. We've seen that Maldweb is pretty egotistical. It's pretty obvious by now if you haven't figured it out. I mean, the only living thing that he actually has in his palace are a bunch of women, but they're frozen in time. And in the maze, he's got these beasts. And the only things he converses with are constructs that he created himself. So if that doesn't tell you anything about Maldweb, then I guess I'm not very good at giving hints on his personality. So Maldweb actually has a moment here where he starts kind of reflecting on some of the things that he's done and some of the magic that he's been using, and he actually starts doubting if the magic that he is using should be used or if he should start employing other types of magic. And so here's kind of the last paragraph of the actual story. Monglut, which is the name of his construct. Monglut, that I should vary my sorceries in the future? Am I not Maldweb, the all-resourceful? Monglut replies, Indeed you are, Maldweb, and it would be well for you to diversify your enchantments. Maldweb in his manner was not ill-pleased with the answers that the automaton had given. He cared little for converse, other than the iron echoing of his metal servitors, who always assented to all that he said, and who spared him the tedium of arguments. And it may have been that there were times when he worried a little even of this and preferred the silence of the petrified women or the muteness of the beasts that could no longer call themselves men. Mal Dweb is a control freak. It's pretty obvious here. He has created his own little world in this palace, where he is essentially God. And to him, that's what he wants. That's who he is. He's egotistical. He wants control. And he has it. And I think it's pretty rare in certain mediums, especially short stories, to really get a glimpse of what the villain is thinking and how he views the world. So Mal Dweb is obviously a hermit. He shuns social activity. So who knows what his backstory was? And if you want to use him in an adventure, I think it would be a really cool idea to give him a sort of backstory that's kind of tragic. He was isolated, and this is how he deals with the world. He can't function in a normal world, so he creates his own, with artificial constructs and beasts that don't argue with him and do whatever he says, and women that have no free will or the ability to move at all. That's Mal Dweb's world. That's his ideal world. As messed up as that is, that's his ideal vision of the world. And you can use that to your advantage. I mean, some villains want the accolades, they want the power, but it seems to me that Mal Dweb just wants peace and quiet. He just wants silence. And when he wants something other than silence, he just wants to hear somebody agree with him. He doesn't want any opinions. He just pretty much wants to hear himself talk. And that makes sense. If you were someone that wanted silence and wanted nothing to do with the world, there would be a point during that where you would just tire of the voice inside your head and you'd want to hear your own voice. So he uses a construct to ask him pointless questions or just to agree with him. And that is the very essence of Mal Dweb. And to me, he is a great villain. And if I have the opportunity in the future, I want to use him. And I want to kind of use him in maybe a actual dungeon. Maybe use his palace as a dungeon. And the history of that palace should be of a mad tyrant that was bent on controlling his population so much that he just wanted silence. That he wanted to be the only one that had actual thoughts and feelings. He wanted everyone else to pretty much bend to his will and leave him alone unless he needed them. And I think you can make a really cool dungeon that way. And I've actually started working on one, a mega dungeon, which I'm still not very good at designing actual dungeons. It's something that I continue to work on. I have designed a bunch of them since then, trying to get a feel for how to do it right, because I want it to make sense. And it should make sense. I'm not saying that your dungeon can't make sense, but in my world, kind of like the vision of Mal Dweb, I want everything to have a purpose. And I want it to meet my vision of what it should look like. So I hope that you found this video interesting, at least. And I really hope that you found something that you can use in one of your adventures. And most importantly, I hope it inspired you to go pick up a book and actually read. Because I feel, like I've mentioned before, that reading is not just important to be a dungeon master, to have a whole bunch of ideas that you can use, but reading is just important by itself. When you read a book, you can learn a lot from the book, and you can learn a lot from yourself. So, from time to time, read something. Even if it's a short story or something on the internet, it doesn't matter. Just read. And who knows? While you're reading, you might actually come up with the next great hook for your adventure. So, until next time, my name's Justin, and this has been Perfect Machinations. Have a good day.